Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
Opposition leader Susan Lee finds herself in an invidious position. The Liberals have actually been performing quite creditably in the Parliament, but Lee is presiding over a party that's split over where its identity should be and indeed who should be its leader. And she's being undermined by insurgents, most notably Andrew Hastie, a leadership aspirant who recently quit the front bench, complaining he was being excluded from formulating policy on immigration. To talk about the Liberals and their troubles, we're joined today by Tony Barry. Barry once observed from the inside as a Liberal staffer, but these days he's a director of the Redbridge Political Consultancy, which taps into the public mood through extensive polling and focus group research. Tony Barry, less than half a year after the election, what's the mood like in the country? Is Labor's present vote entrenched? And how do people regard the opposition?
The Labor vote is shallow and wide. So whilst they won convincingly on a seat basis, 94 seats, their primary vote remains at critically low levels. The advantage Labor has got, of course, is they've worked on over the years a preference strategy. And so they harvest a lot of preferences off the minor parties, which gets them comfortably over 50%. However, there are a lot of headwinds for Albanese. We had a poll in the Financial Review just last weekend, and when we asked about is the Albanese federal Labor government focused on the right priorities, net minus 12 was the result there. So just 35% of voters agreed with that proposal, but 57% disagreed with that proposition. So that 57% shows that, there's still a lot of voters out there who don't really rate Albanese that highly, but their advantage is that they rate the coalition more poorly. And similarly, when we asked whether the opposition had done enough to deserve election, the result was around net minus 50, which is catastrophic for the coalition and a reflection of where voters see them. In terms of the mood sentiment, we did ask a question about how they saw the next generation standard of living. So we asked voters, do you think the next generation will have a same, better or worse standard of living than your parents' generation? And what we found there was 55% of voters said the next generation will have a worse life than their parents' generation. Now we've asked that similar sort of question in various different ways, which is how you should do it in polling. Otherwise it becomes a bit of a beauty contest. But we've also asked that question. We've sort of said, do you think your standard of living will be better or worse in 5 years' time compared to pre-COVID? And we've had a similar response pattern there as well, where over 50% of voters think it'll be worse off. So obviously we know from all sorts of research that there's a wrong mood direction at the moment when you ask voters. And that's no surprise because cost of living pressures and housing and so forth. What is a bit of a surprise is that there's entrenched pessimism. They just don't think it's a 2025 problem. They think it's a 2030 problem, 2035, 2040 problem.
Well, as you say, in this situation, the coalition has been in a world of pain, so it can't take much advantage of the government's problems. It's fighting over whether to move to the right or to try and capture the more people in the centre. Do you think the Liberals can stay as one party in this situation? And in what direction do you think the Liberals should be moving?
We also asked a question of voters in this survey, those who said they'd previously voted for the coalition, but were no longer voting for the coalition. So coalition defectors, in other words. And we asked them if they could rank the reasons why they're no longer voting for the coalition. And what was interesting there was that 35% said, I no longer know what the party stands for. So a values proposition. The third most popular response was, it no longer represents people like me. That was 33%. The one that came second goes to behavioural issues with the coalition, where respondents said it's too divided. That was 35% as well. But there was also, a big values question as well. 27% said they don't understand what their values are, and it doesn't represent modern Australia on issues like gender and multiculturalism. Right down the end of the list, those who say it is become too conservative was just was 15%. Those that said it's become too progressive was just 8%. And those who said it become too moderate was only 7%. So some pretty clear patterns there, which goes to a lack of definition around what the coalition stands for today. And I think from that perspective, probably the biggest learning out of this, and history for that matter, is that they need to look at what John Hewson started and John Howard and Peter Costello finished by having a unifying purpose in the party, which was economic reform back then and tax reform, something to sort of bring the different tribes of the coalition together and fight for a common purpose. Because at the moment, you've got the kind of net zero crowd, you've got the anti-net zero crowd, you've got people who sort of think that trans sports is the number one issue. And so it's all kind of this very fragmented pattern of tribes, as opposed to speaking in a coherent language and speaking with a coherent message. And I think Susan Ley has started that journey. She gave a very strong speech about government entitlement and spending beyond our means. So you can see that she's starting to start that narrative. But these things don't happen overnight. They take a very long time for these messages to permeate and to resonate, and then to start moving the court of public opinion.
Well, just to take a bit of a counter view on the Hewson-Howard analysis, of course, when Hewson put forward a very ambitious, radical economic program in Fight Back, he got trounced by Paul Keating. And I think Howard at the next election really ran on a fairly minimal program, did he not? And took advantage of Keating's, by that stage, unpopularity to win.
Well, I think there's a couple of points there. Houston's still got a primary vote of 44.2%. Now, the coalition would kill for a primary vote of 44.2%. They're about 11 points short of that at the moment. So, yes, Hewson lost, but he was still competitive, if that makes sense. Howard still had, I take your point, Howard's agenda was far less ambitious. But my earlier point was more about it gave the coalition a sense of purpose and a coherent message to repeat, which was about the economy and economic reform. And I think that's what's sort of missing right now. Peter Dutton's coalition really didn't have much of an economic agenda at all, and they allowed Jim Chalmers to win that argument. And, they allowed Chalmers to characterise the Labor Party as the party of lower taxes and the party of lower government spending. And so if the coalition can't win those debates, which have always been its legacy strength, people aren't going to vote for it because it's more progressive or more left-wing or because it's promising to spend more and create bigger government. It'll never win those arguments. And I think, the only way that it's going to be competitive is to have a big agenda. And yes, there is risk. Hewson did lose what was seen to be an unlosable election. But I think the alternative, which is to play it safe and to go into the next election just hoping that there will be this grievance in the electorate that votes Albanese out, I think, could see the coalition go further backwards even.
What we're seeing in some recent polls is support for one nation jumping from previous levels. Do you think this could possibly reflect the sort of direction that's being seen in the United Kingdom, where you've got Nigel Farage really killing the Conservatives. Could people go off onto the right to One Nation or similar parties, and the Liberals just finding themselves squeezed out?
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference in those markets are they have voluntary voting in the United States and the United Kingdom. I think at the last respective elections, it was around 59 and 56% respectively. And so there is a very significant cohort of voters who just don't vote. In Australia, the compulsory voting system, which typically are around a voter turnout of around 90, 92% turnout to vote, you can't pitch to the fringes in Australia. In the United Kingdom and America, you can energize those fringes with niche issues or litmus test issues, and motivate that base to come out and vote. But in Australia, everyone votes, and so you need to pitch to the centre or centre right or centre left to try and get those voters to support your agenda. In one of our most recent polls, with a sample size of around 5,000 Australian voters, so it gave us a strong confidence of the margin of error in those smaller vote segments. The Hanson vote has mostly grown amongst Gen X men. And so what we have seen in our focus groups is real grievance building up in that particular cohort of the electorate, and the enormous dissatisfaction with the government and the opposition. And so they're parking their vote with One Nation, which we've seen climb from around 6% of the election to currently tracking at around 14%. So very significant growth there, but it's mostly coming from Gen X men.
Now, you mentioned Susan Lee, and I would have thought people, if they were fair-minded, would say that her performance so far since the election has been quite reasonable in the circumstances. The Liberals have not done too badly in Parliament, and yet she's embattled, and no one would be putting much money on her longevity as leader. What do you think? How do you see her performance and her situation, and indeed her positioning at the moment?
Well, she was handed a catastrophic party, a party that had got poleaxed at the last election and soundly defeated at the election before that. So expecting her to turn the results around within 6 months just shows a glaring ignorance of politics and how it works. She has got a massive job to rebuild the party, to reposition it, to build equity back in the electorate about what it stands for, its values problem, and we've talked already in this podcast about that. But that takes reach and repetition, and you just can't get a couple of front pages in the newspaper and think that voters are going to turn around and sort of think and reassess their voting considerations. So she needs time, and I think passing judgment on her, as some pundits are doing at this point in the electoral cycle, is just madness.
But isn't she also facing the problem that quite a lot of Liberals, in fact, do not want her to succeed? They have ambitions themselves or support others with ambitions. And in this context, what do you make of the behaviour of Andrew Hastie?
Well, I think, this speaks to the tribalism that we're seeing in the coalition right now, how there's a lack of unifying purpose, no sort of real organising principle. And which is why I come back to this notion that, they need some great crusade on the economy to rally behind, where they can all sort of buy into it and sell that message. But I think, there's also a fundamental misunderstanding by some of the coalition MPs as to where the electorate is at right now. I mean, the coalition got soundly beaten in Western Australia 2 elections in a row. They're about to face an extinction-level event in South Australia. In Victoria, despite an utterly hopeless state Labor government that is now in its 11th year, they're ahead in the polls. Labor are ahead in the polls. New South Wales are in government in New South Wales. So there's some strong messages there about where the coalition brand is at. Peter Dutton, of course, was a flag bearer for the right in the Liberal Party, and he was sent a very strong message at the last election. We, in our last survey for the Australian Financial Review, we asked voters, which of the following statements best represents how you see yourself politically? And again, we gave a long list of options: socialist, left-wing, progressive, centre-left, moderate, centre-right, conservative, right-wing, libertarian, and none of these. Interestingly, none of these was the highest at 27%, which one of my friends reminded me was reminiscent of David Kemp's thesis in the 1970s that Australians, unlike Americans and United Kingdom, don't really label themselves politically. The strongest was 19%, was moderate. However, when we looked at the crosstabs, around 65% of those people who describe themselves as moderate are voting Labor on a 2PP basis. So that was the strongest. But those who describe themselves as centre-right, conservative or right-wing only totaled 27% of the electorate. Those who describe themselves as socialist, left-wing, progressive, centre-left actually made up about 28% of the electorate, plus that moderate band, most of which are voting Labor. So most Australians see themselves as centre-left, or they sort of gravitating towards a centre-left agenda. They certainly don't see themselves as right-wing or conservative. Just 19% of the electorate describe themselves as that way. So you can keep on pitching to that, and if the electorate was made up of viewers of Sky After Dark, then the coalition would comfortably win. But the electorate is very diverse and very fragmented too. What we're seeing is very different voting patterns amongst Gen Z men, Gen Z women, and Gen X men, and so forth.
So does this mean that those who think the Liberals would be better off if they installed Angus Taylor or Andrew Hastie, both from the right, are simply totally misguided?
I wouldn't say that. It depends what sort of agenda and policy direction they want to take the party. John Howard was seen as from the right, and he was a very successful Prime Minister. But he knew that he had to pitch to the centre. He protected Medicare, and he embarked on supporting families. That was very much a part of his agenda. You can call it middle-class welfare, but he found it as, supporting those families that were working hard, good contributors that needed extra government support. And he had tax reform as something to sort of incentivise the workforce. So it is possible to be right-wing, but to be able to pitch to the large section of urban voters that the coalition needs. They only hold 8 out of 89 seats. And, you're just not going to win those urban seats if you're not competing on those issues that are salient to that electorate.
If we look in terms of constituencies, obviously the coalition has major problems with women, with the female vote, and with younger people, both the real youth vote and those who are a bit older but still relatively young. And it's hard to see, is it not, how they can actually change the situation with either of those groups. It does seem that the Labor government has tied up the female vote with a lot of measures and its rhetoric, and the youth vote similarly is simply not attracted to the non-Labor side of politics at the moment.
Yeah, but public opinion is never static. It's always changing and evolving. I look at The Voice, which started at 65% support and ended on 39%. So public opinion does change. The coalition's challenge is to make itself competitive in those cohorts. But you're right, there's a lot of tribalism and fragmentation of the vote. In our poll, Gen Z voters, the coalition was polling at 18%. Interestingly, it was just 13% amongst female Gen Z and 22% amongst Gen Z men. So big difference there, gender split there. But catastrophically uncompetitive. That's the ages of 18 to 28. So it's not a small part of the electorate. Amongst the millennial cohort, which is 29 to 45, the coalition was polling at 25%. Now, under Howard, those younger vote cohorts, he would be beaten by the Labor, but he was somewhat competitive. In these circumstances, the coalition is getting thrashed. So they can't compete overall whilst they're so hopelessly uncompetitive in those cohorts. Now, some projections are that at the next election, the federal electoral roll will be 47% of Gen Z and millennials. So that's a massive part of the electoral roll. And if you're simply uncompetitive like the coalition are, you're just not going to get to 50 plus 1%.
And yet it's very hard. I take your point about public opinion shifting, but it's really hard to see what's going to shift those voters.
Well, I mean, my advice to the Liberal Party would be, the number one issue for younger voters at the moment is housing, whether it be renting or buying. And they need to make themselves relevant to that voter cohort by policies to give them some hope. Now, at the moment, they see no hope with either side. And as we said before, when we ask voters about do they think the next generation will have a better or worse standard of living than their parents, 55% said worse. So, that negative mood sentiment is present throughout everything. We also asked a question recently about, do you think young people today can buy a house without family support? Only 15% said yes, without family support. So 85% of the Australian electorate think young people today need family support, the bank of mum and dad. So if the coalition is to be competitive in these cohorts, I think the best message for them is to give them a stake in the economy, talk about wholesale economic reform that gives people some hope that they can save for a deposit. And I think one of the biggest problems there is the income tax schedule is stacked against incentive. 65% or thereabouts of total government revenue is from income tax. And I think, if the opposition wants to be bold and take a risk and try and make itself competitive, it should develop policies that will reduce income tax cuts enormously. And that might be putting taxes on the investment and asset class to make up some of that income tax cut. It will have to include some government spending cuts. But, I think the coalition is at the point where it has to do something. It has to do something bold.
And what about the female electorate? How do they change perceptions there?
Well, that's actually the most vulnerable in our polling because, and we do a lot of focus groups as well. We have discussions with voters, male and female, and sometimes we do just female, sometimes we do just male. But they're feeling, a lot of women, particularly mums, are feeling the burden of cost of living pressures. And so their perceptions about a lot of issues are very different from male perceptions. Now, I go back, 20 years ago, gender splits on issues and vote for that matter was pretty rare. It was very similar to the male vote or male sort of perceptions on issues. But there are now some very significant splits. Nuclear energy was one. There was a 20-point split between male and female. Around 50% of men were somewhat supportive of nuclear energy as an energy source in Australia, but only 30% of women. But on cost of living, we're seeing some very drastic assessment differences. And we asked a question recently about has the economic conditions forced you into delaying or cancelling various purchases or expenditure, and that included purchasing of white goods, purchasing of cars, starting a family. But on the question of medical expenses, 50% of women said they were delaying medical expenditure because of cost of living pressures. 30% of men were doing the same. But in the focus groups, women were saying that they were basically prioritising the needs of others in their family over their own. And that's a terrifying prospect that 50% of women and 30% of men, for that matter, are delaying medical consults because of cost of living pressures.
The Liberal Party has also had a lot of problems with ethnic communities. It seems to have alienated Australian Indians. Earlier, it had difficulties with Australian Chinese voters. Where do you think things are at now in its attempt to at least break even on the ethnic votes?
Well, again, I come back to a message around economic reform. We do a lot of research with these ethnic communities. We do focus groups of just Australian Indians and Australian Chinese, Australian Asians. And frustratingly, as a Liberal, these communities actually share a lot of Liberal values, but they don't vote Liberal. They're great wealth accumulators, great contributors. They believe in the values of choice and opportunity. They like choice when it comes to healthcare, so they like private health insurance. A lot of growth in private health insurance membership in those communities because they want to be able to choose the medical specialist and the hospital where they go. So we're seeing a lot of those sort of values-based communication conversations with these communities, but they don't vote coalition. So I think the great opportunity for the coalition is to appeal to those electorates with an economic reform narrative that incentivises those communities who already are working hard and accumulating wealth to vote coalition.
And just finally, what we've seen in the last couple of elections are these teal candidates who've been able to amass considerable support as minor players and take seats that naturally used to be Liberal seats. Are these seats gone for good for the Liberals, or can they fight the Teals as well as fighting Labor?
Well, I think, what we're seeing is some of those Teal MPs like Kate Chaney and Allegra Spender, they actually do a lot of talk about tax reform. And so they're speaking absolutely to their electorate. That should be a lesson for a lot of coalition MPs, that there are votes there in those electorates. Tim Wilson showed that if you're prepared to get out there and speak to your values and argue the case, there is opportunity to win those seats back. But they're not going to win those seats back by lurching to the right and alienating a majority of the electorate on issues which are only going to elicit results in various electorates, usually in the regions. That's not where the coalition's problem is right now. Their problem is in urban centres where the great majority of Australian voters live.
And it's obviously a very long road ahead for them. Tony Barry, thank you for sharing your insights and your research with us today. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.